I'd like to welcome you to my Thursday Bread History Seminar Workshop. I am broadcasting from my kitchen in Santa Cruz, California. My name is William Rubel. You can find my book, Bread, A Global History, at Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and other online sources, possibly also at your public library. I'm writing a larger bread history, and really this work in the seminar series is feeding into this new work that I'm writing. So thank you very much for watching. You can go to my Facebook group, Bread History in Practice, join the group. That's where you will get notifications of the live seminars, and also you will see what people are posting who have attended the seminar. If you want to make breads that are mentioned, then go to my website, williamrubel.com. I don't have all of the recipes from each of these seminars posted, but increasingly I do. So you should look there first in the category seminar. Now, I always start with the same two slides. And so I'm going to do that now. Bread is an invention like a chair, a car, a shoe, a necklace. You think about that. And those who've heard it before, it's like reading a poem over and over again. No farmer has ever dug a bread from the ground like a potato. No bread has ever been harvested from a tree like an orange. And no bread has been ever harvested from a field of grasses like grain. Bread was invented sometime in the Upper Paleolithic, if we can even think of it as an invention per se. We're going to be talking about that a bit today. But the women who were the gatherers, the women who were the weavers, the women who were the food processors, worked out this food. And as Jeff mentioned, we find in the earliest bread that we can confirm with scanning electron microscopy is tilted towards white. So even then, clearly that wasn't the first bread. Even then, we see that culture, that personal preference is shifting how the grain is going to be processed, because we can't eat it raw. We can't eat it raw. And everything about a loaf, the choice of grain, whether it's flat or whether it's a loaf, whether there's a thick crust, a thin crust, whether there's an open crumb or a closed crumb, all of those things are choices of culture, just as is whether you have a chair in your home. I travel a lot in Muslim countries where homes may have no chairs. We may just have pillows. I won't say just, people sit on pillows. And then, of course, whether you have to sit on a Louis XIV chair in order to feel comfortable or not. When you look up at the stars at night, those of you who are fortunate enough to live in a place where there are stars, or when you go on a camping trip, and when you can see the Milky Way, we have all of these constellations that have been named in our culture. And you've got Cassiopeia, and you've got this and that, Orion's belt. But something that you're not going to find there is the recipe for the best bread. The recipe for the best bread is written in our hearts. And every culture has its own idea about the best bread, and actually, it can also be divided by class. But we can see that the preferences for best bread probably go back a long time, because those women who made the bread in the Natufian bread 14,400 years ago were clearly moving towards the best bread in the way that they sifted. But it's really central to the way I think is there's no best bread. It's just culture. So I'm going to stop sharing, and I'm now going to read. And the total reading is about 20 minutes. First, a big chapter, and then a little bit from the second chapter. The Big Ship, Rivers and Rivers of Grain. It opens with an epigram that I found on a website from the port of Klaipėda, Lithuania. Presently, the port of Klaipėda goes through the times of records. Recently, a post-Panamax type ship, Piera, was loaded in the port. The fact that will enter the history of the port. By far, this is the largest loaded quantity of Lithuanian export grain throughout the entire history of the port of Klaipėda. In 2014, the Lithuanian port of Klaipėda created a webpage to celebrate the completion of a port expansion, enabling it to handle a class of ship called post-Panamax. This class of ship is too large to go through the Panama Canal. All over the world, ports are dredging channels for these behemoths, beefing up loading and unloading facilities, upgrading roads, train and computer systems. The big ports like Shanghai and Rotterdam adapted first, with smaller ports like Klaipėda following. Somewhere in the world, even today, a port is being expanded for a ship bigger than the one it is currently able to handle. The Piera, the first post-Panamax class ship to berth at Klaipėda's number 67A of the Universal Agricultural Products Loading Terminal, was filled with wheat bound for Iran. The webpage celebrating this berthing tries to help us understand the magnitude of the shipment and inadvertently hints at a web of ancillary facilities, including contractual arrangements that went into receiving the Piera and then sending her on her way. Now, how big is the Piera? The authors of the webpage try to help the lay reader understand. They say that the ship took 4 days to load, but this doesn't mean much to non-shipping specialists. They also tell us the ship holds 1,100 train cars worth of grain, and that such a train would stretch 16 kilometers. Now, I have seen mile-long trains in the American West and can conjure up an image of an amorphous hell of a lot. But how can we really understand how much grain is in those 1,100 cars? I can better visualize this grain mountain when it is converted into bread. The ship holds 74,000 metric tons of grain. Mill into wholemeal flour and then sift to retain the finest starch. This yields 54,000 metric tons of white flour. Mix with water and leavening using a recipe for a standard white bread, whether a loaf bread or a flat bread, to end up with roughly 159 million half-kilo loaves, or over 1 billion 60-gram pita breads. There are 195 million households in Europe. There are 120 million households in the United States. India, with a population of over 1 billion people, has 248 million households. The Indian chapati is made with a fine whole wheat flour. The ship will yield 7 chapati to every household in India. That is the scale of this ship. The 83 million Iranians to whom the Piera delivered her grain are amongst the world's biggest bread eaters on a per capita basis, including infants and old people. They eat around 1 pound, 450 grams of bread per person per day. The Iranians tend to prefer flour that is not entirely white, so their bread yield from raw grain is greater than it is for cultures more wedded to white flour. Even so, the Piera shipment lasted them less than a week. The Piera is a child of the world. It was delivered to its original owner, the steamship Mutual, on October 28, 2010, from the shipyard Sungdong, Korea, under the flag of the Mediterranean island nation of Malta. In 2018, it changed owners and was renamed the Star Piera, with its registration shifted to Liberia. As long as the ship is afloat, you could go online and look up its latest positions. As I write this sentence, it's between Kaohsiung, Ankh, Taiwan, and Jiangyin, China. A few weeks ago, it was at a port in Gabon, West Africa. This instant internet lookup system is not meant for you and me. It exists for the trade. When you think about this grain-filled ship, I want you to think of the web of relationships that extend outward from the ship back to the farmer who planted and harvested the grain, and to his banker and his insurer and his weather consultants, and the supercomputer feeding crunch data to that consultant, Those programmers, the satellites feeding information to the supercomputer, and his drones for checking the fields, and on through every pathway and industry that supports this trade, and then forward to the trucks, silos, mills, bakeries, and shops, and home bakers who will get its grain. Think of the boat's financing, its insuring, and the salvage companies in wait for the ship when it gets into trouble. In imagination, strip the world of everything except the industries that feed and are fed by the grain trade. Strip away all the uses of the systems, like insurance for us, like the internet, like drones, like satellites, from everything they do besides supporting the growing, harvesting, shipping, milling, baking, and distribution of bread and wheat-based bread-like products like donuts, pasta, couscous, and Chinese steamed buns, bao. For me, this mind game highlights that our technological world co-evolved with domesticated bread grains. In that English nursery rhyme that celebrates all the absurd things that happened inside the house that Jack built, there is reference to the farmer who planted the corn, which is wheat in the language of the day. Stepping back one layer, it is the corn that fueled Jack, who then built his house. We know that it was the domestication of the bread grains that triggered an explosive phase of innovation, a phase that has not ended. The bread came before the satellite. And take the bread away, and the satellite falls, as there's no way our planetary social and economic systems could take the instant loss of 1/3 of our planetary calories. While it can sound narcissistic to see one subject, in this instance bread, as the center of all things, in fact, the history of bread and its consequential effect on human culture is not a chicken and egg situation. The grain was planted first, and the towns, cities, and empires of Southwest Asia, the Mediterranean coast, and the European peninsula followed, with bread as their foundational food. Grain has been being moved around since grain was first domesticated. At first, it may have just been movement within a household, as from threshing floor to storage. But it won't have taken long for the first basket of grain to have been moved from one household to another, one village to another, one region to another. One of the primary cultural shifts between subsisting on a hunter-gatherer diet and a diet of domesticated food is that the hunter-gatherer spreads their risks. Like a diversified stock portfolio, bad times might pinch, but they're unlikely to starve, in contrast to the farmer depending on grain. Lose that crop, and you are lost indeed. The political and social stability of the world depends on the easy flow of wheat, a crop that still satisfies more than 30% of our calories. Every year, more than 1 billion metric tons of grain are exported out of exporting countries into importing countries. This billion-plus ton mountain dwarfs what we can now visualize as a tiny toy ship engaged in a Sisyphean project. As you are reading this, rivers of wheat are flowing into silos, and rivers of wheat are flowing out of silos. As you're reading this, an unfathomable number of rail cars are moving over track all over the world, shifting grain from one point to another. Trucks are turning right, turning left, sitting in traffic, pulling into and pulling out of grain elevators and flour mills. Trucks are arriving at grocery distribution centers, unloading bags of flour, or pulling up to large bakeries where the flour is sucked out of the truck into bakery grain silos. As we're reading, a constant flow of wheat is being fed into mills, large and small, which are in turn spitting out one grade of flour or another. Somewhere in the world, bakers are starting their shifts, and somewhere in the world, bakers are ending shifts. Dough is being mixed, breads are being formed, and some formed into loaves by robotic devices, others being formed through the touch of bakers. Ovens are being turned on, and ovens are being turned off. Bread is cooling, and bread is being purchased. As you read this, bread is moving by foot, by car, by bike, by scooter, by boat, by horse, and even somewhere for sure, by camel, from a bakery to a home where a family will sit down to a meal with bread, which they will bite into, chew, sense its taste and texture, and feel comforted. And armies are marching on stomachs filled with bread, and someone is dying having been shot or bombed by a soldier powered by bread. And buildings are being both raised and raised by workers with bellies sated with bread. And of course, farmers are farming. Some are planting their wheat crop for next year, others are planting, others are harvesting, others are tending plants in the ground, others are waiting, hoping that the weather holds for the harvest. Somewhere right now, a farmer is talking to a banker about a loan for the next season, or in despair, is considering suicide. Research scientists are researching trucks and rail cars being built, as are sidings, roads, warehouses, and on and on. That is because the largest crop in the world by acreage is wheat. This is an area so vast that if concentrated in one place, it basically covers all of Europe through the Levant and encompasses most of Saudi Arabia and Egypt. No London, just wheat fields. No Jerusalem, just wheat fields. It started so slowly, so very silently, so very unimportantly. Nothing more than shadows within a fog. Silently, they slipped out of their trees, rose on their hind legs, and what had been climbing hands take up one rock to shape another. And at the end of the day, under the protection of a smoldering fire, they lay their heads down to sleep. Control of fire became their superpower. The more they used it, the more the control they had over their immediate environment, and the more control they had over material processing, setting up a cycle of technological and social advances that eventually burned that fog away. In the light of the noonday sun, in a manner more purposeful, more organized, more determined than any other animal had been, the humans spread out from Africa and prospered. Taking an expansive view of when human culture began, while at the same time picking a largely arbitrary beginning, one can say it took roughly 2 million years for a human species to build a boat large enough to hold 74,000 metric tons of wheat and then move it thousands of miles from Lithuania to Iran. That roughly 2 million years dates to Homo erectus sensu lato, the first humans to walk out of Africa armed with fire, power-enhancing tools, and their sights focused on the horizon. So that's the end of the first chapter. And I'm now going to read the beginning of the second chapter. And after that, you can, in the manner of custom at readings, you can applaud after the second bit. So you'll take yourself off mute. And now for the opening of the second chapter. There are no walls in Eden. All good stories have a clear beginning, middle, and end. It is terrible when a story doesn't have its ending. So you ask, what happened? I don't know, says the erstwhile storyteller. The story isn't over yet. I don't want to be that kind of storyteller. I don't want to leave you with an unresolved ending, and I'm not going to. I spent one summer in the early 1990s recording stories that Babu, a fabulous village storyteller who lived in northern Kenya, told to me. Now, Babu means grandfather, and that's what he'd been called since he was 4 years old, Babu, the little one with wisdom beyond his years. When I met Babu, he was in his late 30s, and truth to tell, he was beginning to be drawn into the hapless world of the village drama. It has been years since he was able to tell a cogent story, much less a riveting tale. In the years that I recorded his stories, he was electric. He started each recording session the same way. Now, he would say, always leaving a long pause. Today, and again, always leaving a long pause. I am going to tell you a story. I am going to tell you the story of the brave Moran, or the story of the Mazungu wedding, or the crash of the baby's coach, or the Moran who is as strong as an elephant. And then he would be off in full flow. In honor of Babu, I begin my story thus. Now, today, I'm going to tell you a story. I'm going to tell you the story of bread. Before bread, we were small. After bread, we became giants. Bread gianted us, not necessarily as individuals. Grain agriculture reduced the stature of many a free hunter gatherer into a broken backed laborer or even slave. But collectively, at the much bigger scale, it has made each of us giants. Perhaps just an ant looking up at the Great Pyramid, but it's an ant that could look up in awe at what he and his fellow workers had created. However long, deep, and dense Mount Everest's shadow might lie upon the land. Our shadow is now longer, deeper, and denser, spreading as it does across the full face of the earth. The story of bread is the story of a food that began as one amongst many that, at the close of our story, has become the ring that binds them all. Although when this first part of the story closes and the next part begins, nobody knows they have created the ring of power, to which from henceforth they and their descendants, one and all, would be bound. As I am writing the story, knowing how it all turned out, I can tell you that while today's chapter ends on a happy note, there's an undercurrent to the ending that can be put this way. They knew not what they had done. Thank you very much. Thank you. You can off mute, we can all hear. Thank you very much. Thank you. And welcome David, a guest I was looking for at the beginning. So what I want to do now is I'm going to talk a little bit about the subject of that first chapter, the second chapter, and then open for discussion. And I'm going to leave you, the discussion is going to be centered around the cultural changes that took place at that first moment in the pre-pottery Neolithic. So that means the period when we began to rely on crops that we grew near our houses and stopped being hunter-gatherers. Now, how many of you read the book?
William, I'm sorry, but
yes?
I have to stop you and to raise a glass for the first chapter. I'm waiting for it for a long time, and now I will wait for the last one. But no patience. Do it now.
Well, thank you. Thank you, David. Thank you very much. David is an archaeologist in Israel who I had generously has allowed me to participate in a Natufian milling project. We've talked about it at a previous session on domestication. We're going to mention it again today. And I think David will have for sure some 2 cents to put in at various points. And again, of course, everybody, this is a seminar, so you're all free to interject at any time. So I'm going to talk a little bit. I'm going to try to go fast, speed up, so we have time to have discussion. I'm really interested in this. How many of you read the book *Sapiens*? Who's read *Sapiens* or knows what it's about? Any green hands? Anybody? Okay, Avery. So the concept in this book, the real big epiphany, and those of you who perhaps like me have suffered from messy houses in life and finally found the light through that wonderful Japanese woman whose name I always forget because I have a problem with names, who has this little book that really could be reduced to one sentence, which is, if you don't have a shelf for it, don't buy it. In the same way, *Sapiens* can really be reduced to the concept that our power is story, and the power of the human species is our power to create fictions that we then believe in and act on. I think he's got his great funny joke is that no chimpanzee could be convinced to to forgo a banana today for unlimited bananas after it was dead, and that's sort of the crux of Sapiens. But that is where I want us to begin um, when we get to discussion period, and to ask, how did the cultural stories change at the point of domestication fused with bread? How is it that that unleashed these innovative forces that are the ones that allow us right now, with Anne in England and David in Israel and Tony, I think, in New York, um, to be together this way? Because my thesis is, this is bread. This is bread. Bread is the one that has shifted us out of the Holocene into the Anthropocene. And that really is the core story of my book. And everything else, whether it's Greek bread, which is the subject of our talk November 11th in 2 weeks, or Egyptian bread, or English muffins, all of that is really window dressing. That's just, like all the different varieties of dog, when ultimately you're just talking about one species, one thing, one magical effect. So I'm going to share the screen again. And okay, I'm going to speed up. Satis quercus, acorns have had their day. And I do want to read this. This is an adage by Erasmus, and he is channeling Greek and Greek and Roman mythology. An old adage aimed at those who have left behind a squalid way of life and proceeded to a more polished and wealthier one. It comes from the fact that early men, rough and wild as they were, abandoned the habit of living on acorns as soon as Ceres showed them the grain. Now, this is part of really another creation myth. We're going to be really dealing with the Jewish creation myth today. But Ceres brings grain and banishes acorns. And of course, the Greeks, like us, we're all children of the Neolithic. We go into a forest, and what the hell could you possibly imagine eating enough of to survive? And the obvious answer is acorns. Okay, it's not true. It's not true. But this was the myth. It's one of the many fictional histories that is also a chapter in my book. But this is a prejudice here, and I want us to really get that, just remember this prejudice. If they were rough, they were wild, they were unsophisticated, and they sure as hell didn't make white breads. The concept that we're going to be talking about today is this shift: cultivation versus domestication. Cultivation, a human action that enhances the survival, reproduction, or growth of certain plants. It may include preparing soil, planting seeds, seedling tubers, and other plants. Okay, you're just taking a plant and planting it. If you go out and pick a dandelion, a puff, and plant those seeds, which I have done. I grow dandelions in my garden. I am cultivating. That's all I'm doing, is cultivating. Domestication is different. Describe genetic and morphological changes on the part of a plant population in response to selective pressures imposed by humans. Okay, so I have to start doing something to those dandelions. Like, now I don't want any. I want the ones that bloom, that grow the biggest leaves, and I get rid of all the ones with small leaves. I then only reproduce the seeds from the ones with the bigger leaves. That would be exerting pressure. So we are going to focus today where we may be doing some cultivation. We may be doing some cultivation, or will be doing some cultivation in a pre-pottery Neolithic site. And that is the point where I want us to start thinking about what happened to human culture, what changes in the story may have taken place. Now, I like to use um, the Jewish creation myths. Next week, we're going to be doing the Greek ones in 2 weeks. Bereshit. It just means beginning. Do you want to pronounce that for us, David?
Yeah, very well.
Okay. It means beginning, beginning. And Genesis is the early modern term for beginning. It had a non-biblical use. It is the books of the Torah are all given the names of the first word. Hebrew doesn't have articles, so there is no in the beginning. The English translators in the 1500s translated Bereshit in the opening as in the beginning, but we had that word Genesis, beginning. So I'm just going to use beginning. Now, this book, Beginning, has multiple authors. The creation story is told twice, and another one of the stories is told 3 times. The first creation story, Beginning, is Arcadia, is actually it's before Eden was created, but it is Edenic. And God said, let us make man in our image, after our likeness. Let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the fowl of the air, and over the cattle, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creepeth upon the earth. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God created he him, male and female created he them. And it goes on. He creates us. He gives us all the herbs for meat. It says, that's the verse 30 down there. I have given every grain herb for meat, and it was so. He sees everything is good, and he says, wow, what a lot of work. It's the end of the 6th day. I am going to rest. Ice sheets are still covering the northern hemisphere. And amazingly, at the glacial maximum, so there is no Ireland, there is no Wales, there is no North Sea, there is no English Channel. These are all covered with ice. At that time, by the Sea of Galilee, at this number here, now you go type this in, 37.22093 north and so forth, into Google Maps or Google Earth, and you'll get what you've got on the right. And you'll see that the dot is in the water. So what happened is 23,000 years ago, at the glacial maximum, a group of gatherers, hunters, and fishing people. Okay, they lived gathering, they lived hunting, they lived fishing. Suddenly, the buildings, the roofs collapsed, and that was inundated overnight, just inundated. They think it's speculated that a dam broke and suddenly rose to the level of the Sea of Galilee, and this made this just unbelievable preservation of this community. Unbelievable preservation. The floor of this round hut was covered with grasses and flowers. There's a bedding. Those of you who have been to Muslim countries, you're invited to someone's house and you sit on pillows around the edge. This had pillows around the edge. It had separate places to work. The women sat there, and maybe men also, napping, making, sharp edges on stones. There was lots and lots of barley, so much barley that they speculate they must have been growing barley, cultivating barley. And there's a grindstone. And this is what it looks like. And 150 grains of starch were pulled out of this grindstone and run through modern magic. And of those, we know some were bread-making grains like barley or wheat. And near this grindstone, and around this grindstone, are 550 grains of bread grains, what we now think of as bread grains, plus some other other grasses. So you just kind of have this image of this woman is sitting there and she's processing grain on this thing little by little, and then you know ran, run! Someone screamed, run! The tsunami alarms went off. Now, near it is a structure that speculates that the archaeologists speculate could have been used for baking. There's some stones that have ash on top of them, but it's prepared stones, not just the ground. Um, Now, the village chapati, and today I say we're not focusing on the flour so much today. It's just baking method. So a village chapati baking method is to set the dough, flour and water, freshly ground, is to set it on a griddle so that the dough is no longer sticky top and bottom. And then they take that bread and they put it directly on the cow dung embers or lay it up next to the fire like this. And the dough finishes, and in fact, it puffs into a ball, like the pita bread that most of us are perhaps more familiar with. So it's possible that you certainly could heat the ground and you could set the dough that way, or like Bedouin baking, you could heat the ground and put hot ashes over it. David, did you have something to say about the
Yes, yes. You mentioned speculation because it's more than speculation because they have a real fact that they can show and prove those the starch grain. But if you look at the number and quantity, quality is very important. But first, quantity. It's not much to make a bread of. I mean, even 1,000 grains, yeah, and it's a very, I would say, far away yes, assessment that they did have bread there. I mean, they didn't have they have the wild yeah, wheat and barley, no question about it. It was there always growing in the north part of Israel. In the southern one, where we were working, only barley is growing. Most of it is barley, but the question is the quantity and the means to produce. You mentioned the trucks and the ships and the technology. So they didn't have the technology. They did probably they had they ate the products mixed power kind of power mixed with water as you know it's very well still now is being used as a, as a wheat meal
Okay.
instead of bread.
Thank you,
Okay,
David. Thank you,
bye.
David. So, so there is though enough. There is enough there, and the archaeologists who are reporting this to speculate that they certainly could have may have made bread with it. It's generally thought that when you have starch grains deeply embedded in a grindstone, that was for making flour rather than making a porridge. Um, and this is evidence. There's sickles, and they've analyzed the striations, giving the sense that they were using them to harvest grain. Again, this is at the glacial maximum. Thinking back to Erasmus Rough and Ready, these are artifacts from the Natufians. That's David's specialty, and this is 15,000 to 11,500 before present. These were hunter gatherers, mostly sedentary. They had um, um, set communities. Certainly, those of you Americans who know the chain Williams and Sonoma, you could certainly imagine buying those grindstones at Williams Sonoma. Instead, they're like 12,000 years old. So the rough and ready is an idea you've got to get out of your head. The culture was a lot more sophisticated than rough and ready before grain domestication. There's David and my friend Jane at this Natufian site, Huzek Musa. If you go online and type in David item plus one, you will come up with this article. And then I joined him a few years ago in, I think, 2018. And I don't remember exactly, but a few years ago in Israel to test grinding on Natufian facilities. What you see on the left is a little grindstone area in the bottom left-hand corner where you would kneel and grind grain, and some stone cut mortars. Up in the top right, you're seeing mortar where you can hummel. No, that Jane is pounding the grain on a stone cut um, um, threshing floor. So in other words, they've changed the level. It's not. They've made it flat, and then there's also a nice big straight-sided mortar for hummeling. This was hulled grain, so you had to process the grain. You see it in Egyptian pictures. They're not grinding the grain with the pounding, but what they're doing is freeing the grains so that it can be further cleaned and ground. So this is this site. This is that time period. These people became the first farmers, and we now have genetic proof the skeletons are genetically the same. I mean, from doing the ancient DNA analysis. So these Natufians, they became the Neolithic. So they became us in the sense that they stopped being hunter-gatherers. They would typically have 90, 100 taxa, 125 different taxa that they ate from. And I think what the concept that I want to focus on is that during this period of human culture, yes, we had bread, and we know we had bread. Jeff showed the paper from a 14,400-year-old Natufian site where there's like no question they've got a little piece of burnt starch, and the analysis is, yeah, this is a bread-like product. But this bread didn't change anything. It didn't change anything. It was a food amongst foods. In good years, remember, it's still not the Holocene. We're still not in the Holocene. The weather has not stabilized to the stable weather of our childhood. It was just a food, I think it was the favored food because of what happened next. But it was just a food amongst many. So I link this to the first creation myth in the Jewish religious books. And these are pre-domesticated cultivation. This is what we're about to get to. These are grains that have not been changed from the wild and that come from a pre-pottery Neolithic site. In Asia, they invented pottery thousands of years before farming. In Southwest Asia, they invented farming before they invented pottery. So the second beginning, and this is where, let's say this for a couple minutes, and then we're going to move into discussion. So it's very clear, on the seventh day, God ended his work. Okay, so we finished on the sixth day before, and he looks around, and everything is good, except realizes in verse 5, and every plant of the field before it was in the earth, and every herb in the field before it grew, for the Lord God had not caused it to rain upon the earth, and there was no man to till the ground. So then a mist comes, and the Lord God formed man of the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living soul. So this is the second creation, and this is where Eve, the woman, is created from the man's rib, and this is the second creation story where he puts the most desired plants into the Garden of Eden, puts Adam and Eve, and says, "Look, guys, you live here, you take care of it, and everything's going to be fantastic. But whatever you do, don't eat from that tree of knowledge. Just don't do that. And of course, we all know what happened. They do that. And this is the important part. And unto Adam he said, because thou hast hearkened unto the voice of thy wife, and hast eaten of the tree of which I commanded thee, saying, thou shalt not eat of it. Cursed is the ground for thy sake. In sorrow shalt thou eat of it all the days of thy life. In sorrow. Thorns and also thistles shall it bring forth to thee, and thou shalt eat the herb of the field. Thorns and thistles. Horrible, horrible curse for a farmer. In the sweat of thy face shalt thou eat bread, till thou return unto the ground. For out of it wast thou taken, for dust thou art, and unto dust thou shalt return. I mean, really gross, really mean. What a horrible curse. So, I want us to come back here. And this is where we expelled ourselves out of Eden. You see in the back here, it says, DBCA, they're growing some wild grain and making bread with it. And they realized, and they've also, getting some baby goats and sheep and herding them and realizing, this is really the meal ticket. We can do this stuff around our house. It's a lot easier. It proved actually to be a lot harder. And the life we can see from the skeletons of hunter-gatherers in Southwest Asia are healthier, bigger, stronger, taller than subsequent Neolithic people. Again, on an individual basis, the Neolithic has not been good for us. It's good for us. Look, no calluses, but obviously not good for the day laborer in India or the poor person in America in Appalachia. But what happened was this combination of agriculture plus bread. So I consider this the second invention of bread. It was brilliant and it moved. And this is showing the dates. It moved east and west. If you think, those of you who have read Guns, Germs, and Steel by Gerald Diamond, this is the thesis. It's easy for plants to move laterally because the climate's more or less the same, hard to go up and down. So it moved east and west along the 34th parallel north, roughly, which is like where Syria is, and a little bit north, a little bit south. And it made it to the Atlantic Ocean. It made it to the Pacific Ocean. Now, Rousseau said this, and this is what we're going to talk about now today. The first man who, having enclosed a piece of ground, bethought himself of saying, "This is mine," and found simple people enough to believe him, was the founder of civil society. From how many crimes, wars, murders, from how many horrors and misfortunes might not any one of us have saved mankind by pulling up the stakes or filling up the ditch and crying out to his fellows, "Beware of listening to this impostor. You are undone if you once forget that the fruits of the earth belong to us all." Well, of course, the fruits of the earth don't belong to us all. Bread plus domestication, that's Nimrod. That's the world conquest of the colonial powers. That's the conquest of the entire Nile River Valley by one person, the Pharaoh, who owned everything, all the wheat fields, and you worked for him. Greece. And of course, finally we get to America. This is Cargill, one of the world's biggest dealer in trade. And of course, American power is definitely rooted in bread, absolutely without question.